All right, welcome back everyone to the lecture series on American literature, the American Literature Survey course. I am Eric Diamond. I am going to be your host through today's journey and investigation. We're going to be doing a little bit of key unit vocab on this sort of mini unit or sub-unit that we have before the chronological progression. We're just talking about major ideas of American identity. How do we define Americans, ethnos versus demos, and then of course the quote-unquote summer reading, which when I normally teach this course, there is summer reading. My students usually read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, so they have some familiarity with that book going into this lecture. If you haven't read it, I'm going to spoil it a little bit for you, but I think it's important information to know. You should also know that as scholars of literature, we're not really reading for plot. There are no spoilers in literature class. I have had hundreds of novels spoiled for me in my time doing academic investigations on literature, so don't worry too much about that. But if you have read it, good, you're going to be well prepared going into this. Just know, as a sort of important introductory point, this is not the lecture series on Huckleberry Finn. So later, when we get through all the different units, like in particular when we finally arrive at the unit for realism and we do Mark Twain, I'm going to have a lot more to say about Huckleberry Finn. We'll look at that novel a lot more in depth. But we're just going to kind of do a bird's eye view right now where we talk about major characteristics of Huckleberry Finn, its relationship to realism, a little bit of its relation to American identity, though the previous lecture covered that, I think, in a bit more detail, and just give that kind of general overview. But you should know going into this, the progression of this class is going to go as follows. So we have this unit right now on American identity, and then we're going to proceed chronologically, which the videos are not coming in chronological order per se. I'm kind of covering the topics as I feel like covering them, and then I'm going to put them in a playlist later where they have like an actual progression for the class and for students who are going through things chronologically using the Norton or the Riverside or whichever anthology they're working with. But in any case, after this unit, we'll go to Puritanism. We'll then do the American Enlightenment or whatever you want to call it, this sort of the neoclassical period of American literature, followed by entering into American Renaissance with the Knickerbocker School, then Transcendentalism, and then the American Gothic, or as some people call it, Dark Romanticism, your Hawthorne, your Melville, your Poe. After the Civil War, we'll of course have realism, followed by naturalism, followed by modernism, followed by postmodernism. And with the unit on postmodernism, we will conclude the class. Now, this lecture series is legit, like I have big aspirations for it. It is going to be hundreds of videos long, so buckle up, get a copy of your Norton, get a copy of your Riverside. We're going to have a lot to cover. But for today, I just want to give you key vocab for this particular unit that's going to help you focalize what it is we talk about when we talk about American identity. And that's something we're going to go over through the entire course. So I don't think I'm going to answer that today. Really, this whole class is designed to answer that question of what does it mean to be an American, especially considering, as we talked about in the previous lecture, that's not an ethnicity, that's not a language, that's not even necessarily a common historical experience for a nation as young as we are. So how then do we define this Americanness? That's something we'll touch on today, but I think we'll fully answer, or at least get close to fully answering, throughout the entire lecture series. We're just covering vocab today, and you should know, if you've seen my video on the Puritan vocab, you may already have some sense of this. The way I cover vocab is not me standing up here giving terms. It's me giving a sort of philosophical back and forth with the terms. You'll get the definition as an incidental, but it's more a organized way for me to reflect on important key ideas that I want you as the student to know, rather than just me dryly repeating terms. But without any further ado, we will go ahead and get started. So, part one, aesthetic and critical concepts. This actually doesn't have that much to do with big goals in American culture, but it is something I want to approach before we start talking about my particular approach to American literature, because my approach is probably not the approach your high school teacher had, and is probably not the approach that most college seminars on American literature have. My approach is thoroughly historicist, and this is something you need to know, especially if you're new to the study of literature, is that there is no such thing as a monolithic interpretation of literature. There are interpretations that we can deem more or less correct, and there are ways of assessing whether an interpretation is more correct than another interpretation. But by and large, there is no one universal what do you want to say, a universally agreed upon method by which we're going to interpret literature. That does not exist. In fact, there are many different competing schools of what we call literary theory or critical theory. Critical theory being the theory of how we produce literary criticism and determine what is good, what is bad, what should be part of the canon, meaning the collected body of texts that we generally agree upon deserve to be read, what should not be part of the canon, so on and so forth. That's actually a debate, and it's a very contentious debate that still goes on within the academy. And so you have three major modes of interpreting text that we're going to discuss today. Now, there are as many different what we call hermeneutics, meaning methods of interpretation of text as you could possibly imagine, more than you have fingers and toes, right? We could spend days and days and days going over this material. In fact, if you're interested, I would be happy to offer a lecture series on critical theory, on literary theory, starting from Plato and going all the way into the early 2000s. I think that would be a lot of fun. We could go through the Norton anthology of literary theory. If you would be interested in that, just put a comment down below. I'd be happy to start doing something like that. But today's just going to be a general overview. And so the three major schools that I want you to know for the purposes of this lecture are Historicism, Formalism, and reader responsive criticism. Okay, Historicism you see here represented by this guy. That is Stephen Greenblatt. And Greenblatt is very famous for popularizing something called the New Historicism. He was a scholar of the early modern period, which is to say the Renaissance, and he was very influenced by a French thinker by the name of Michel Foucault and his discursive analysis and genealogical analysis. We're not going to get into too much of that here. Just know that Greenblatt is a famous historicist figure. There's a historicism that exists before Greenblatt. Greenblatt kind of revolutionizes things and changes the way historicism is done, but you don't need to know much more than that. What we talk about when we talk about historicism is we're looking at literature within the context of human history. That means looking at literature as documents that influence history, and that also means looking at the history that influences the production of the literature. So it goes both ways. And what we say in the historicist mode of interpreting literature is that literature is primarily to be understood as a historical phenomenon. That does not mean we don't see it as an aesthetic phenomenon. That does not mean we don't look at it as a formal phenomenon. That does not mean we don't look at how it affects us personally, the way it makes our lives better or worse. It just means to say that we think like us as historicists, and I am definitely a historicist if you haven't already figured that out. Us as historicists, when we interpret literature, we see literature's influence on history and the historical context behind a literary work as being the primary scholarly focus for our critical understanding of the text. And so the way I approach American literature is I want to read the books that we read in this particular lecture series, not because they're the best, though some of them are. Like A Streetcar Named Desire, one of the greatest plays ever written. Great Gatsby is a phenomenal novel. Like some of the stuff we're going to look at is really, really good. Other stuff we look at, like the poetry of Philip Freneau, is not that good. But the reason why I believe we look at the text we look at in the sequence of an American Literature Survey course is not because they're the best, is not because they're the most formally interesting, nor because they're going to change your life and make your life better. For most people, reading the Puritans is quite boring. So why do we read them? I believe we read them to understand the national idea. So I really believe in the importance and the centrality of nation. I think nation and ethnos are super important literary categories. And they're as important, and I think they actually play off each other, but they're as important as language. And you can't have language without history and ethnos, and vice versa. You can't have history and ethnos without language. And so to that end, I actually don't think the formal categories, meaning the actual structural aspects of the literary text, nor the sort of appetitive qualities of this is good, this is bad, are the central aspects in understanding literature. When I read American literature, my primary goal is to understand how Americans produce this document. What is specifically American about this text? How does this text relate to the historical experience of the American people? And in what historical context produced it? And why could this document be only produced in this historical context? So to give a clear example of this, if we look at Huckleberry Finn, I would say Huckleberry Finn could not have been produced in France or Nigeria or China. And in fact, it's not just that, well, of course, they're not going to talk about the Mississippi. Of course, they're not going to have a character like Jim. whatever. No, it doesn't have anything to do with that. It's that the actual structure of Huckleberry Finn, what Huckleberry Finn is trying to convey and say, cannot be translated into another culture. It has to be written in English. It has to be written using the words that were used to write it, which in this case is the vernacular, common everyday speech. We'll talk about that later. But even just the actual structure of the plot, the way things proceed, the way things begin, the way things end, you could make the characters Chinese and try to sinify it in a certain sense by saying, oh, we're going to use the Yangtze, right? We're going to have a character who's this instead of this. It's not going to work. It can, Huckleberry Finn as a novel and as a story only functions and only makes sense within the American context. Because why? An American produced it. And because Huckleberry Finn has a microcosmic, macrocosmic relationship with American society. The more you understand Huckleberry Finn, the more you understand America. And vice versa, the more you understand America, the more you understand Huckleberry Finn. Because if I'm coming at it from a foreign context, let's say I'm German and I know very little about America, even if I go look at an atlas and figure out, okay, there's a river called the Mississippi, okay, there's a state called whatever. I look at all these different things. I, not being an American, am not going to be able to relate to it as well as an American who is 14 years old is. And in fact, I'll tell you a story with this. A good friend of mine, who we haven't talked in a long time. At this point, he's probably an acquaintance. But had a very good friend, knew very well for about a year, who was Chinese, fluent in Chinese. He had read more books than anyone I knew of, right? He was working private equity in New York, making loads of money. Very, very intelligent guy. In fact, one of the most intelligent guys I've ever met. And he said to me once, he goes, you could study Chinese for the next 20 years and you will never understand the 4 great Chinese novels the way a 17-year-old in China can understand them just intuitively by being Chinese. And of course, those novels are not written in modern, contemporary Chinese vernacular. But what he's trying to convey is the very experience of being Chinese and growing up in China and speaking Chinese, even if it's different, even if it's a variant, allows one to read a novel like Dream of the Red Chamber or Water Margin or Journey to the West in a way that is so much more intimate than anything I could do coming in from the outside. Even if I spent tons of time studying Chinese, become fluent, study Chinese culture, I'm always going to be a little bit of a foreigner to that. And so to that end, I really do believe in this idea of national literature, and I think if we're going to have an American Literature Survey course, it's not just a random way for us to say, oh, well, we want to read The Great Gatsby and we want to read whatever, A Raisin in the Sun, so on and so forth. So we're just going to agglomerate all these texts together into a curriculum that doesn't really have any significance. No, it has to be historical and it has to move chronologically because we're looking at the development of the American idea within the texts. Perhaps a bit complicated, perhaps a bit high level. If you have questions, put them down in the chat. I'd be happy to answer. But that's what we mean when we talk about historicism. And there are people who disagree with that. Like, for example, the formalists. You can see this in the Russian formalists. You can see this over here. This is Kenneth Brooks, who is a famous new critic, what's called the New Criticism, which is the American version of formalism that comes after World War II. Very interesting historical context on that. But the formalists say, look, history is fine. They're not disagreeing that history is important. What they're saying is history is less important than the formal structure of a literary work. That means the actual way that language is being used. So these are things like literary and rhetorical devices, like a syndentin, anaphora, like all the different things that add to the literariness of a text. The use of a particular meter, the use of a particular structure, the way a text is operating within given generic conventions. Like, for example, a comedy usually ends with a wedding. Like, all of these structural concerns are what formalists are interested in. They're very interested in genre, they're very interested in rhetoric, they're very interested in language and structure. And historical concerns may be relevant to them, but at the most extreme formalism, and you do have this, you'll have some formalist critics who say, actually, it doesn't matter who the author is, like his biography, what we know about how he grew up, like that's, the author is not important. Nor is the author's historical context important, nor is the national context that like this text is operating within. And some may even go as far as to say the linguistic context, so that would be a very radical form of formalism. But in any case, the formalists are basically saying, let's ignore all the historical, philosophical, intellectual history elements, and let's just concentrate on the text, the literariness of the text, not in an appetitive sense, because the formalists are not concerned with, is this good literature, is this bad literature? They're more concerned with, how is literature being constructed through the use of form? This is a very formalist way of looking at text. I find it less interesting. I find it less satisfying. I think it obscures the real purpose of literature. But this is really what formalists are trying to do, is they're trying to say, effectively, history is a secondary concern. Now, the historicist critics have responded to this. So there's a very famous historicist within the Marxist vein of historicism by the name of Terry Eagleton, who has a book on literary theory. Highly recommended. I think it's a good introduction to literary theory. And Terry Eagleton, in his book on literary theory, he points out, he's like, well, the new criticism in America emerges after World War II. So notice, he's doing a historicist analysis of formalist criticism. It's very meta. But his historicist criticism of formalism says, look, formalism itself emerges in a really interesting historical context, which is in the post-World War II period, you have all these GIs getting back from the war. GI Bill puts them in college, and all of a sudden you have GI Joe who's in a Harvard classroom, and it's like, oh my goodness, he doesn't know whatever, who Virgil is, or what Pindar wrote, or the whole history of the Greco-Roman world, all these different conventions that are being used by these different authors. He's kind of ignorant of this whole backdrop. And so maybe instead of talking about Pindar in relation to whatever, like that particular historical context in that particular place and time, let's just look at the odes of Pindar just as formal text. Just look at them as literature and try to alienate them from their historical context. And American pedagogy, following the pragmatist vein, really picked up on this, which is why formalism still remains popular. I would say less so at the university level, which is more dominated by historicism, but much more at public school, private school level, where you'll have like people who teach text, teachers who teach texts, and they basically say, let's try to look at like what makes this literary. Let's look at the literary devices that are being used, the plot structures, this, that, the other. Because why? It's easier to teach a class that way. I think it's just for reasons of convenience. Not saying you can't have a good formalist analysis, but I think a lot of it comes from convenience of like, well, if I teach an American Lit survey historically, I'm going to have to explain philosophy. I'm going to have to explain history. I'm going to have to teach all these boring texts. I'm going to have to do all these things that like take forever, and I just don't want to do them. Whereas if I teach it formally, I can get through things very quick. 40-minute class, we can do a close reading, which is the standard technique of formalism. You've probably heard of close reading before. We're going to do a close reading of a text in 40 minutes, kind of deconstruct it a bit, figure out how all the pieces are working together, and everybody leaves feeling pretty edified, and nobody leaves feeling stupid because they don't know anything about history. Formalism is caught on a lot. And even more than formalism, you have this third school, presented by this guy right here, Stanley Fish. You've got reader response criticism. And the goal of reader response criticism is to say, actually, let's decenter the historical context, the author, and the formal literary linguistic context. Let's actually center the reader. And so the idea of the reader response critics, and this is very, if you know anything about postmodernism, you'll see this is very postmodern. The reader response critics are basically saying, hey, look, if I read Milton, let's say I'm reading Paradise Lost, and you read Milton, the words Milton uses are going to evoke different images in your mind because we have different sets of experiences. Like we have different linguistic experiences, we have different levels of experience with literature, we have different personal histories, we have different knowledge of the textual history, we have different knowledge of Milton's life, we may have like some personal circumstance that's going on that may make the text more or less interesting, whatever. But the Milton that exists for me in my head is different than the Milton that exists for you in your head. And so to talk about there being one universal Paradise Lost for a reader response critic is ridiculous. There are a plurality of Paradise Lost. Okay, like that text exists in a plurality of interpretive communities, and those interpretive communities do the work of interpreting them differently. And because of that, there exists a sort of multiplicity of texts. We can't actually talk about there being one universal text. We're always actually in the process of negotiation and recreating the text as we read. So this idea of reading as a creative process. And so things like the reader's response, as you can imagine, as the name implies, like your emotional response to a text becomes more interesting. Now, Stanley Fish is actually a smart guy. He's operating in this vein of postmodernism, American pragmatism. He was a huge fan of Richard Rorty. He's a smart guy, and like his books are actually interesting I am about as far as you can imagine from being a reader response critic. But it is a point of view worth studying and worth taking seriously. But what I will say is at the far end of this, you get the awful, just truly awful public school curriculums where instead of the teacher, like the sage on the stage, everybody makes fun of it. This is the way I teach, right? It's like, you all shut up. I stand in front of the lecture hall for 50 minutes, with the whiteboard, and I go over everything. And you ask questions, and sometimes I ask you questions. We have a back and forth, but I am teaching you. Like, I know the subject, and I give you the information. That's how I do it. Formalism is a little bit of a middle point where it's like clearly the teacher knows something, but we're all kind of deconstructing the text together. And then reader response criticism really decenters the teacher because he's just one interpretive community among many. And this is where you get to sit in a circle, and everybody's in a circle, and we talk about like what did the text make you feel? Like, how did you feel about that? What were you thinking about when you were reading this, right? And everybody's opinion is as good as everybody else's, and we just kind of have a feeling session, make a poster board, and it's all good. That's not Stanley Fish, strictly speaking, but the sort of pedagogical or popular interpretation of Stanley Fish really does lean that way. So just be aware of that. If you had an English teacher who was very like touchy-feely, this is kind of the ideological basis of where that comes from. In any case, we are historicists, so this entire lecture series is going to be approached historically. I will use aspects of formalism and even reader response criticism, but I am a historicist critic. And I operate, I would say, within the sub-vein of historicism called New Historicism. I think some of the Marxist critics do interesting things. It's not my personal cup of tea for any number of reasons that I could get into, maybe in a larger literary theory course. But when you read my analysis, or rather when you listen to my analyses of various texts, you're going to see, if you know anything about New Historicism, that they operate very much within the vein of New Historicism. Good. Any questions about that, put them down in the chat, and we will continue forward. We're going to talk about the foundations of American identity and national myth, but I would be remiss if I did not give you a brief ad to just, one, like and subscribe, trying to grow the channel, trying to get this message out to more people, and share these lectures on American literature, which I personally think are quite good. I would have liked to have had these when I was 15. But also take a look in the description. I have two things that might interest you. One is a program for how to graduate college in 2 years. That's the College Degree Accelerator. You may know I graduated college when I was 19. I got into a PhD program when I was 20. If that's something that interests you, take a look at that. I also have another program called the Scholar's Path, which is all about, you can think of it like academic or intellectual self-improvement, not going to the gym and taking cold showers, but like what do you actually need to do in life to become an intellectual, because people don't tell you that. You can take a look at both of those programs down there. In any case, let's talk about this. Foundations of American Identity and National Myth. So the big central concept in this unit on American identity is this idea of American exceptionalism. Because when we read John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity, which I already have a lecture on, you can go listen to that. It's called American Corporatism. Right from the get-go, there is a sense that the people who are coming to the New World in the English-speaking context, meaning like the proto-Americans, because remember, Americans do not exist until 1776. Like, oh my goodness, if I can get one thing in your head, there is no such thing as an American until 1776. They are created out of whole cloth. And even during the Revolutionary War, people talk about like the Americans fighting the British. No, not really. They're all British. It's not the Revolutionary War is a civil war between two groups of people who are functionally identical and who belong to the same nation. Americans are invented out of whole cloth. But in any case, it's not totally true to say that, because it is true that the people who come to the New World start to think about things differently. And so John Winthrop, right from the City Upon a Hill speech, which Ronald Reagan is later going to quote from, in the context of American exceptionalism in the Cold War, right, liberal democracy being so much better than communism, according to Ronald Reagan, in that particular speech, John Winthrop is going to say, we shall be as a city upon a hill because old, degenerate Catholic and Anglican Europe is going to look back at us and go, wow, they did something right. They're materially prosperous. Oh, that's going to keep coming up. And they're godly. They're following the Bible as prescribed by Christ, at least in their interpretation of it. And so we have to repent of our sins and we have to become like the Puritans. But right from the get-go, as I mentioned, there is an idea that Americans are unique and Americans are different. Now, every nation has a self-conception of itself as having a unique historical destiny. Many nations have forgotten this in the period of liberalism and globalism, but there is a sense that, like, for example, the Russian people have always had a self-conception of themselves as going to be the saviors of humanity, as we're going to preach true Christianity to all peoples and unite them all under Christ. Like in the 19th century and still part of 21st century Russian geopolitics, Russia's salvific mission to the world, to save the world, particularly from liberalism and sort of evil Western philosophies, that like has never gone away. You look at Spain, one of Spain's great like national, what do you want to call it? I mean, it is a national myth. The myth doesn't mean false in this instance. It's just like a national core belief of their historical mission. Is one thing Spaniards take enormous pride in, or at least they used to, is the idea of mestizaje, that unlike the Portuguese, unlike the British, unlike the French, we intermarried with the native population, whether it was the Muslims during the period of the conquest, whether it was with the Jewish population, because there was a high degree of intermarriage prior to the Jews getting expelled from Spain in 1492, or whether it was with the indigenous population in the New World, which many Spanish historians actually see in their historiography as a continuity with the Reconquista. They'll actually say, like, in all of those periods of Spanish history, the conquering of the Philippines, right, the actual unification of Spain with Asia, the opening of Spain to Asia, there was always an emphasis on intermarriage. In Spain, there was never any sort of racial or ethnic sentiment of superiority. And so the idea for the Spanish is our unique historical destiny was the conquering of race prejudice and ethnic prejudice. And that still remains as part of the Spanish historiography. You can agree, you can disagree, but that is an enormous part of the Spanish self-conception of themselves. And also being the warriors of Catholicism. The Spaniards always said, we are the sword of Catholicism. Well, Americans, part of their self-conception is America is distinct from all other nations and is uniquely exceptional in the sense that we are the first democracy or republic in the Western world since pretty much Athens. I mean, you have the small Florentine. You don't really want to call the Florentine republics republics. They were what do you want to call it? Just truly like degenerate oligarchies. But an Athenian democracy only lasted 50 years, so whatever. But the whole point is, like, we'll see this when we get to the Enlightenment, is that the American thinkers over and over and over again say, hey, we are really and truly distinct in the sense that this is their historiography. You have Greece, you have Rome, and then after Rome you have the Dark Ages where humanity is just in superstition, and then America picks back up the task where Greece and Rome left off. And so the idea is we are picking up the legacy of ancient Greece and Rome, we are carrying forward democracy to all the nations, and we will bring freedom, prosperity, and Christianity to all the peoples of the earth. Freedom, Christianity, and prosperity. And that we, as Americans, are uniquely positioned to do so. If you're seeing links between this and like contemporary American foreign policy, you're not wrong. But this is a central aspect of the American identity, again, as I mentioned, even 400 years ago. National mythos, we talked about this a little bit. You have Romulus and Remus right here. Romulus and Remus, one of the founding stories of the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire. National mythos, it doesn't have to be a myth in the sense of something false. It's just like the collection of stories and like narratives of self-conception that make up a people. And so part of the American national mythos, yes, is this idea of spreading democracy to the nations, but it's also like there are smaller parts of our national mythos, like the story of John Henry, the story of like whatever, Daniel Boone, right? The stories of the Civil War that actually happened, the brother fighting the brother in the Civil War. Pickett's Charge, like all these different events make up the national mythos. Some of them true, some of them false, but all these different historical events, stories, narratives are part of the self-conception of what it means to be part of a given people, in this context, the American people. Okay, Turner Thesis. Yeah, Frederick Jackson Turner, very famous historian. I'm not going to get too much into the Turner Thesis. It actually is a very specific thesis with like outlined points. I don't want to get into that too much. But one of the ideas about the American self-conception that scholars have noted comes from Frederick Jackson Turner, who has this famous speech where he basically says, look, America is uniquely shaped by the existence of a perpetual frontier. Meaning, if it were not for westward expansion, Americans would not be the way they are. The idea is that you have a community starting in, like, let's say, New England, and the people who are the most enterprising and least likely to get along in civil society will eventually just feel like, it's too cramped here, I can't get on here, I want to make some money, I want to explore, adventure, And so like the sort of most virile stock of America, the most adventurous types, but also like the types that can't get along with anybody, the most individualistic, in some sense, the most American of that particular group of people, they move west and then they go to, Ohio. And then eventually they found, a small community in Ohio. And then, 50 years passes, and then the most enterprising and virile and adventurous of those types will go, I just can't stand it in here. My neighbors, I got kicked out of church, right? Like, I can't do it. And then you go west. Go west, and you go to Iowa. And then after you go to Iowa, you go to Colorado. And after you go to Colorado, you go to Arizona. And after you go to Arizona, you get to California, right? And part of the American psychogeography, like I lived in Los Angeles for 5 years. Amazing experience. But everyone knows if you're in Los Angeles, the most insane people in the country are all in Los Angeles. Like the most insane people are in California. Well, part of the American psychogeography is, I think, the fact that every time you got kicked out of a community, every time you were just a little too right in the head to fit in socially, you could always just move westward. And so Turner thought westward expansion really it's what made Americans strong. It's what made Americans great. And now that there's no more frontier, Americans are going to become, sort of degenerate. They're going to become weak. They're going to lose their sense of Americanness, and they're going to lose their values. And so, of course, this gets later used to justify imperialism of, well, if we conquer Cuba, we conquer the Philippines, we eventually conquer Mexico, we conquer South America, and we have a hemispheric empire of democracy, which is later tried. Right, they try to accomplish this with the OAS after World War II. We could talk about that. I had a whole class, by the way, on history of the Spanish-speaking world that I used to teach. I have phenomenal stuff on that as well. If you're interested in that, I would love to teach that because it involved the history of countries that people know so little about. Like I had a whole unit on Bolivia. We had a whole unit on, obviously, like Mexico, Colombia, big countries. We had a unit on Equatorial Guinea, which is the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa. Lots of cool stuff I have for that. But in any case, the idea is like, hey, we can have this hemispheric empire and you just keep finding new frontiers. And in fact, this gets evoked by JFK in the space race because JFK is going to say space is the final frontier. It's the last frontier. And so America's got to go to the moon. America's got to go to Mars to expand democracy because without this idea of we can always go somewhere else, we can always flee, there is no America. Whereas if you think about it, like in another country, like that's much smaller, okay? Like Belgium. Belgium is like, you have the stupid joke from Eurotrip, right? Europe is the size of my backyard. To an American, Belgium is the size of your backyard. It's like a non-entity. It's not to ignore the history of the Belgian people. Obviously, a lot of really interesting things happened. And there was Belgian colonialism. We all know that. But the idea of frontier to a Belgian is very, very, very different than the idea of frontier to an American. There is something super unique about that idea of move westward, go westward, that you're going to see comes up in a lot of the literature that we read. Like, for example, Natty Bumppo in The Prairie, this is James Fenimore Cooper, the first early Western novels. He's going to die facing the sun setting in the west, and that's like a huge allegoric moment that we'll discuss when we get to that unit. Because, again, the West, the westernness of America, the following the setting of the sun, this is like a super important symbol that's going to come up again and again and again, and again is an important part of the American self-conception and identity. Moving on to other terms, self-made man, rags to riches story, both relate. Americans are obviously very individualistic. This is part democracy, this is part the frontier, this is part the Enlightenment, the fact that America is basically like the most radically enlightened of all enlightened nations other than France. You get this sort of, and France is much more of a collective enlightenment. America is much heavier on the individualism for societal reasons that we'll talk about in the period of the Enlightenment when we get to that unit. But Americans have always had this idea of the self-made man. You can see this as early as Ben Franklin, and it's going to move forward to people who become more Ben Franklin than Ben Franklin, right? Andrew Carnegie, Booker T. Washington, who you have right here, who all basically say, hey, I started from nothing. Like Booker T. Washington literally was a slave. Or you'll see this in Gatsby. Gatsby is a self-made man too. You're going to see lots of characters who are self-made men throughout the course of these lectures. And the idea is they started from nothing, but they worked really, really hard and they made something of themselves. And a subset of self-made men go through this narrative called the rags to riches story. You see this in the novels of Horatio Alger. And in a Horatio Alger story, you have a young man, usually between the ages of 9 and 13, who is very poor, but he's industrious, he's willing to work hard. pulls himself up by his bootstraps, and eventually becomes rich and rises through civil society. Well, why is that distinctly American? In Europe, you can't do that. Okay? Make myself clear. In Europe, you can't do that. In Europe, if you're born a Russian serf, you will die a Russian serf. There is no hope of you becoming a czar or a boyar or anything. There's maybe a chance you become a priest, but barring that, there's no social advancement. You're born in a class of people, you're likely to die in that class of people. There's not a lot of social mobility, but America is the first nation that is actually predicated on this idea of social mobility and sees social mobility not as a destabilizing factor, right? Because for most of human history, people saw social mobility as an evil, as something that is actually bad for society. And in fact, you can make a case that social mobility still might be a bad thing. I won't get into that, my personal opinions aside. Looking back at the American context, social mobility for the first time becomes a good thing, particularly after the period of the Civil War, where you have the sort of capitalization of American society, the industrialization of American society, people making tons of money, immigrants coming in. There's this idea of the American dream, this romantic American idea that here is a country that is free. And if you just work hard, you can become anything. It's not like corrupt Europe with all its rules and aristocracies. You can really become anything. And that's going to come up over and over again. We're going to read and look at both autobiography of Ben Franklin and the autobiography of Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery, and you're going to see this come up multiple times. And in fact, I always, like in my classes, I do a quick survey of my students and I say, hey, how many of you guys would say that your parent, or I usually say fathers, your fathers consider themselves self-made men? And almost always half the room raises their hands, right? It's like, oh, my dad's, a Korean immigrant, and he says he came here, he didn't know the language, and he had to work really hard, and it wasn't like being in Korea, but like eventually, now he has money, and now I'm here, and I'm American, and he's really proud of me, and the fact that I'm an American, and this, that, the other. And so like that comes up, or whatever. It's like, oh yeah, my dad was a plumber, he worked really hard, he saved up all this money, and eventually he owned his own plumbing business, and whatever. Now he hopes that I can become a doctor. Like, this story seems to never end. It's part of the American idea. And the fact is like the rags to riches story and the self-made man, I don't think people in Botswana think that way. In fact, to a certain extent, like even in other quote-unquote developed nations, like I don't think people in Spain think that way. And to the extent that people in Spain think that way, I would say that's under the influence of America, because I would say 70 years ago, before Netflix and before global culture, I could assure you people in Spain did not think that way. Or almost the overwhelming majority of Spaniards did not think that way. This is something it's in the air. It's in the psychosphere. It's atmospheric sort of liberalism and Americanism that just rubs off on you by virtue of being born in this country. We love these stories. It's just part and parcel of what it is to be an American. They're in the collective unconscious. And the idea behind the collective unconscious, this comes from a psychologist, or rather a psychoanalyst by the name of Carl Jung. He's building off the theories of his mentor, Sigmund Freud. We're going to talk a lot about psychoanalysis in the unit on the Gothic, dark romanticism, when we get into the Edgar Allan Poe stories, the Hawthorne stories, all that good stuff that students really love. But in brief, Freud basically thought, look, you have this thing called the unconscious. You can't actually put it into words precisely because it's the mind that you're not consciously aware of. It's where you get your dreams from. It's where different associations come from. And it's actually the powerhouse of your being. Like, your unconscious mind is far more powerful than your conscious mind. But it's still part of your identity. It's still like your ego is within the conscious mind. That's your self-conception of who you are. And the unconscious, you don't really have that externalized. You can't talk about it because it's not conscious. But to a certain extent, it remains within you. Like, I am not affected by your unconscious in any real or significant way, unless you like do something by accident, you lash out at me, whatever. But Jung takes this theory much farther, and Jung actually says, no, there are universal archetypes and symbols that are housed within all cultures across humanity. And in fact, like Jung would say, like, we have an unconscious mind as human beings that all of us can tap into and have access to, and can even like send messages to other human beings through the unconscious, right? I think there's a Jungian critic who says, like, in Nazi Germany, people started having collective nightmares. Like, people would all have the same nightmare at the same time. Some of this stuff gets weird, so you can choose to believe it or not. But Jung has this theory that, like, basically we can tap into this, like, immense psychic power that is shared by all human beings, that is not, like, encapsulated within one person, within one body, but that goes across all the human bodies. And so there's something of this when we talk about historical criticism of literature, and when we're looking at like how literature is produced by a historical period and how intellectual history functions, because a lot of it is atmospheric. Like, I actually make the case that I think there's just something about being in the United States, hearing American television, hearing American English, talking to Americans, like driving down American streets, living inside of American buildings, that like it just like, even if I was born in Korea, if I stayed here for 10 years, I would have some degree of Americanness to me. That's always why it's like we have the first generation who comes, who inherits some Americanness, but primarily has the traits of where they came from. Second generation, maybe they know the language, but they feel much more American. And by the time you get to the third generation of anyone, like it no longer matters. You're fully American, right? We all know someone like this, where it's like, oh yeah, 70 years ago, my parents came from Mexico, my parents came from Poland, my parents came from Korea, whatever, but like I don't know the language and I have no attachment to the culture. This is the case for me, actually, because only 3 generations ago, I had a great-grandfather on both sides. One great-grandfather who's in Hungary, another great-grandfather who's in Poland. I speak no Polish, I speak no Hungarian. I have no attachment to the culture. Like, even if I hypothetically, like, tomorrow could speak perfect Hungarian, if you dropped me in the middle of Budapest and was just like, go figure it out, like, they would figure out I'm an American, even if I spoke perfect Hungarian. They would just look at the way I eat, the way I dress, certain parts of my habitus, just my general being, would just come off as American. And people would be able to figure it out. In fact, I actually have a good story about this. So, I was coming back. So, the long story is, we're going to Orizaba, visit family. And in order to get to Orizaba from where we were living in Los Angeles, the cheapest way was to take a bus to Tijuana, from Tijuana, take a domestic flight to Mexico City, from Mexico City, take a bus down to Orizaba, and then like do the whole thing over again. And on the border of Tijuana, you have a truly awful city. I apologize if you live there, but like, it's one of the worst places I've ever been. Like, Tijuana's not bad, but on the American side, you have a truly awful city called San Isidro. And as you would imagine from the flight, we had like just been in Mexico City the day before, or not, like a couple hours before, actually. And so we're in this McDonald's in San Isidro, looking around, and like all the people phenotypically are Mexican. Like, they're brown skinned, they looked Mexican, and they were talking in Spanish. But there was just like they're not Mexicans. Like, I was just in Mexico City, I saw Mexicans. These people, even though they speak Spanish, even though genetically they're Mexicans, there's just something about them that's like, they're not Mexicans, they're Americans. They act more like Americans. And you see this with certain liminal identity groups, like in Los Angeles, the Chicano population. They have some of this idea where it's like, hey, I don't really feel like a bourgeois, white, grew up in Los Angeles kid, because I didn't. Like, I grew up in Westlake, in Los Angeles, whatever. We were really poor growing up, spoke Spanish in the house, this, that, the other. But like, if you dropped me in San Salvador, I would have no idea what's going on, right? Like, anytime I have to talk to Mexican, let's say the person's, I gave a Salvadoran example. Now let's say they're Mexican. Anytime I have to talk to Mexican relatives, I have no idea what's going on, even if I can speak their language, just because like I grew up in the States, I grew up in Los Angeles, and so I feel like I don't belong to either culture. There really is something there, which again is part of the reason why I think approaching literature through this national lens is interesting and enlightening. Okay, and I think you should try to approach literature that way too. Archetype literally just means great symbol. I addressed this a little bit in the last lecture. These are like sort of pivotal key items or totems that represent either larger psychological principles. For example, the wise old man archetype you can see in Gandalf, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Tiresias, so on and so forth, or specifically national archetypes. So I had that lecture on the national archetype of the orphan in Huckleberry Finn. You could go take a look at that if you're interested. Good. Part 3, we're going to look at literary movements and forms in the adventure of Huckleberry Finn, but I'm actually going to call it a day for today. I will post this as a part 2 lecture for those who are interested, where we will go back and talk about some of these issues in American identity and Huckleberry Finn, and also move a little bit away from historicism and talk about just some of the formal characteristics of Huckleberry Finn that I think you should be aware of early on in this lecture series. Hope you got something interesting out of it. Give this a like and subscribe. Take a look at the courses in the description. See if they're interesting. See if they're for you. As always, if you have any questions, leave comments below. I love getting comments. I love answering questions. I'm a teacher for a reason. Take care, and I will see you all around.